Here is a brown ink by Sailor Bungubox Ebisu.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
Had I started using this with the wrong pen, I would have hated it. And I'm calling this a brown, though it could kind of be a yellow or perhaps a golden brown. It does give good tone variation by pen, and I mean, it needs it good because, yes, it can be a little too light, depending. Again, thankfully I used the right pen. I'm going to try and take care of some of the construction noise that I'm hearing in the background during the writing sample that you're seeing. Hopefully I get it all out in post. It shades very well, fairly well, from most every pen I used it in. It certainly is a unique color to be seen here that I generally enjoy, even though it can be light on the page, lighter than I'll normally go for, but still a great secondary color here.
The pen for today is a Cross Bailey. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we see this is quite a bit light. This is really, it looks like it's having flow problems. It's not really. It's just kind of on the page. Now, this is a very dry writing soft fine pen, so it's going to bring out all of the worst qualities. And I think it kind of does, as it's generally a little too light for me. Now, we get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get some very nice shading throughout all of it. In fact, when it's shading, when it is looking at its absolute best, because you can read it without any kind of a problem. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, and thankfully so. Now, this isn't my favorite tone that this is going to give, but it is easily read on the page. No feather, no spread, shades very well. You see it really in every single word. Look at that second line all the way across, where it's giving us nice and dark, light, constant back and forth in the tones. Truly very nice to look at. I do wish this was, it's like it's showing a bit more of an orange look, that golden brown kind of color. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the soft fine nib. Darker than it was, lighter than it was with the wet fine nib, darker than it was with the soft fine. That way I can say it correctly. The tone here is really, to me, beautiful. This is perfect. I really do like how this looks on the page. Performance-wise, we get no feathering, no spread. We get shading. The shading with this paper and this nib is not as standout as I would prefer. It's certainly there, and we get to see it in most words. It's just that it's not standing out especially well. I kind of wish it would shade a little bit more along the lines of what we saw with the wet fine, with the tone we're getting here with the medium nib. Looking at the broad nib, it is a tad bit lighter than it was with the medium. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get plenty of shading. It shades very nicely to look at it. The tone is very nice, even with it being a little bit lighter. I say it's shading very nicely. Even though it's shading less than what we had with the medium, I think what we're getting here really is a kind of beautiful sunset sort of look to it, which is, that reason that I was saying perhaps a yellow. I think there's a little bit of variation in what you can get depending on that pen. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There were approximately 5 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is right about the same tone as it was on the Clairfontaine, yet more frequently readable, making it much nicer to use with this paper. It certainly has areas that it gets a bit too light, like on took on the first line. Those O's right in the middle got very, very light as a tone. Now we're getting no feather or spread. The shading that's happening is very nice and really working in its favor to keep it looking nice here. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. It is a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now we get no feather, we get no spread, we do get shading, and it shades pretty darn nice. I can't complain about what's happening. Non-fountain pen friendly paper that's really helping this ink by letting some of that shading come through. Look at these on the top line compared to way directly underneath it, or how it's shading in and out of darker letters on the word better right next to that. Looking at the medium nib, it is about the same tone that we had with the wet fine nib, just about the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get shading very nicely. Shades just as well as it did with the wet fine on this paper. I think it shades about the same that it did on the Clairfontaine. Again, it's a very gentle in and out of what's going on. It keeps all of this very readable on the page. Really very nice. Of course, I do wish it shaded a little bit better, but I really like the color that I'm seeing here. Looking at the broad nib, it is a tad bit lighter than we had with the medium, a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, no spread. I think the shading that's showing up here stands out a little bit better than it did on the medium. It's shading about as nice as it did with the wet fine. In the areas that it's getting darker, it's getting much darker. And we have a lot of mid-tone variations going on, making this really very nice for this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. The tone of this paper is really going to help this ink out quite a bit, though you see it does look like it's a bit more orange leaning, and that's going to be an effect of the tone of the paper. Not in a bad way here, really doing a good job. No feather, no spread, shades very well. Even if it's in its lighter areas, you can read what's going on, though it can get pretty light, like you see on feet or seamed right in the middle here. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, bit more orange leaning as well, with no feather, with no spread, with shading that is pretty good. I think it's shading a little bit nicer here, even though it's shaded more standout on the Clairefontaine. I think in what we're getting here, it is quite a bit nicer. Look at following on the second line, where it starts darker, gets light at the bottom of the F, dark into the L's, in the O, transitions from darker into lighter. Very nice. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine. No feathering, no spread. It does shade, and it shades fair. I don't think it's shading as well as it did with the wet fine nib, but it's still shading about as well as it did on the Clairefontaine, though what we're seeing is more shading through oranges here. So if this is a paper you like and really want to use an orange ink, this might be the one to get that appearance more of a very orange leaning ink. Looking at the broad nib, it is a bit lighter than it was with the medium, bit lighter than on the Clairefontaine. Still kind of an orange lean, but we are going to see some areas that really show it kind of as a yellow with no feather, with no spread, with shading, though the shading shows up much better in the first word. Ignoring that, in general, the shading goes from a kind of yellow you can read on this paper, which is nice, to a kind of mid, sometimes darker orange, giving it an interesting character on the paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a return to some of that performance from the Clairefontaine. Very light, though it is coming across a little bit darker than we had on the Clairefontaine, making it a little bit easier to read. Back to the whole people say it's the same paper, and it's not exactly the same. So there, I don't know. It's a bit different in what we're seeing. I think it's easier to read here than it was on the Clairefontaine, even with the quad rule. No feather, no spread, shades nicely. I don't think the darker areas are standing out as well here as they did on the Clairefontaine, but I think that's because of the quad rule drawing a little bit of attention away from that. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is the same tone as the soft fine. Quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, with no feather, no spread. It is shading better than it did with the soft fine. It's kind of a difference between a drier writing and a wetter writing pen. The shading that's showing up here is certainly very standout, and it's doing a great job at it, especially those nice dark letters at the beginning of most words. Looking at the medium nib, it is only a tad bit darker than it was with the wet fine nib. Little surprised there. Lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, with no feather, with no spread, with some shading. The shading is not a huge thing here, but where it is, it does it very well. Saying it's not a huge thing because it's not a dramatic from light to dark. It shades very frequently. The word "and" starts dark at the top of the A, gets lighter into the N, darker at the D. 3 letters, 2 shifts in color. Fantastic. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. There is no feather. There is no spread. There is some shading. It's there. It's actually not doing too bad a job. It's not a standout thing. It's more something that your fountain pen users are going to notice, but your ballpoint users aren't. So depending on who you're around would depend on who could appreciate this as much as I do. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman SBRE Brown. Here is Colorverse Hubble Zoom. Here is Diamine Saddle Brown. Here is Noodler's Rome Burning. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Bit easier to read on the Clairfontaine, though if you used this ink with this nib on this paper, your teacher might have a little bit of feedback to you about it, because it's not really the best for that. Now with that, its performance is perfectly fine with no feather, no spread. It is shading very well when it does it. The darker letters really do stand out. It's the lighter letters that don't stand out as well. And if you're not in a very well lit room, this could be incredibly hard to read. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is in general the same tones that we get with the soft fine. We just get more of the darker tones. No feather, no spread. I think it shades better in that you get more of those darker tones as we're writing here, making it more usable. Though, sort of look at that third line where all the confusion and most, that part is not the easiest to read. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the wet fine nib. It is a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is no feather. There is no spread. There is shading. And it's doing a fair job. I'm much more captivated by the color that I'm getting here. That is really very nice. Works very well. Not a primary to me, a secondary most likely. Wouldn't have an issue with in your notebook. But as a primary, a whole page, even at this tone, I don't think that would be a good idea. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone that we had on the medium, a tad bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get shading. I think it shows up just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Just like in the medium, when it's shading, it's doing an especially good job at it. Look at the word way on the top line. On, into, the. It shades very well when it does it. The biggest problem is its lighter tones. If you get too much of it, like the word tunnels on the second line, it starts to get a little bit harder to read. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements this color on the page. Here is Pilot 100th Anniversary Pink. Here is Ackerman, their number 26. Here is Pen BBS number 138. Here is Montegrappa Blue Black or Dark Blue. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather. It does spread, and while normally I'll consider those to be a negative thing, in this case, I'll go ahead and call it a positive because it's making it even easier to read from this pen, which we've seen sometimes that it does get more difficult. Now, it does shade, and it's shading fairly well, which almost gives me a little bit of concern on whether or not it would bleed through it all. But as long as that holds up, I think this is pretty decent. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the soft fine, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get feather, we get spread, both of them. The darker tone definitely has all of this fairly easy to read, really looking much more like an orange leaning yellow than a golden brown. We do get some shading, which isn't always a good thing, but look at how nice the word forward shaded, or swift, or weasels. This looks really good on this paper. If you must use copy paper because you insist on it, and you can get away with using this ink, I think what we're seeing here is fairly nice. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine. We still have feather, still have spread. None of the feather or spread that I've mentioned in any of these do I see as any kind of thing that would stop you from really using this ink on this paper. I'm merely mentioning that it's there, not that it's unusable. Now, it's not really shading much, though, yes, there is some shading. You do see it in Gandalf on the second line and Herd on the second line. I don't generally hold out to see shading on these cheaper papers. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than it was with the medium. I want to say right around the same tones that we're getting on the Clairfontaine. Now, of course it feathers, of course it spreads. I don't like the way this one looks, where with the medium, I think it was much more dealable. With this broad, it really starts to look a little eh. And so I wouldn't really want this. Now, we get moments of shading that do occur, like where the G of goblins crosses the L of silently, but not really shading. And so I'm hoping for good things there. Looking at the page underneath, there's only one spot that the broad did bleed through touching the page underneath, but this being a lighter ink, people might not even really notice. Seeing the back of the page, you see that you can't write there because of the amount of ghosting and how deep the ink gets into the paper.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
As had been seen, a dry pen is just generally too light to be able to fully enjoy this ink, at least for me. Let's darken it up with a medium flow or a medium to wetter flow medium nib. Medium, not a wet fine nib, because for me that wet fine was just darker than I would prefer to see this ink, and it became more of an orange leaning instead of this kind of golden brown that I'm sticking with here. I really liked that. Again, it's a medium to medium wet flow, a medium pen for the best showing of this ink on the page.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.